By 20, I was a college dropout working at my cousin's daycare. That's right around the time my depression kicked in. It also didn't help that some of the mothers were as young as I was and already happily married. I wanted that for myself as well. I was clearing the snow from my car one morning. A stranger walked past me and we locked eyes. He smiled and then stepped over to me asking if I needed help. I declined, but he insisted, and before I could protest, Matt started small talk. But I really didn't want him to leave anyway. He was attractive and sounded like a nice guy from his conversation. I was already headed somewhere, but we exchanged info and agreed to pick up our interaction at a later time. The next thing I knew, we really hadn't left from one another's side in weeks. Matt revealed him and his parents were going through a tough time, and he had just got to town to try to find work, but things weren't really looking well. He had moved in with a childhood friend, but suddenly the two of them weren't seeing eye to eye. So Matt said he might be moving again soon if things didn't turn around. That's when I gave him the spare key to my apartment. Besides family, I had only lived with my college roommate, but sharing my space with Matt was wonderful. He was more of a neat freak than I am, so he was always cleaning up. And he cooked so well I started eating beef again after going 3 years without. But Matt had a surprise for me that I wasn't prepared for, and I should have just said no. I came home from work with an invitation sitting on my kitchen counter. My boyfriend was inviting me out to dinner to celebrate 3 happy months together. The location was a surprise. The invitation said all I had to do was be ready at 6 p.m. So I went to the nail salon the morning of our date. My living room was filled with flowers when I got back to my apartment. Matt said he was leaving out so that I could get ready and that he'd be back at 6 o'clock sharp. To my surprise, we both were on time. Matt rented an SUV and we pulled up to the valet at one of the most expensive restaurants in town. I asked him if he'd found a new job. He told me he'd explain everything during the meal. When we finally got to that conversation, everything started moving so fast. He informed me he had gotten a job offer. One of his old co-workers in construction was working on a big project and could use Matt's help. The only problem was, the job was overseas. I was crushed. I didn't want a long-distance relationship, especially not an international one. But Matt had other plans. He was asking me to come along. I was excited that he wanted me to go with him, but I knew my parents wouldn't be thrilled about the idea. Matt said he knew that too, but he was hoping he could change their minds. The next thing I knew, Matt was getting down on one knee in front of me. He pulled out a ring and popped the question. I was totally caught off guard, and it felt like the entire city was watching and waiting for my answer. I said yes. As expected, having to talk with my family wasn't the easiest thing to do. My parents had only spent limited time around Matt. They felt they hadn't known him well enough to be comfortable with us moving so far away, and they didn't think that I knew him well enough either. But I had just turned 21. My parents couldn't stop me, but it would have meant a lot to me if I had their support. Matt had already purchased our plane tickets. The flight was a few weeks away, so my parents still had some time to think and discuss things. But unbeknownst to them, in the meantime, I had already started packing. A week before the flight, my dad invited Matt and I out to lunch to give us his decision. He let us know that he was still uneasy about the situation, but he said he wouldn't fight it under one condition. My father wanted to fly out with us to see the living conditions we'd be in, and he had already booked this flight too. But for some reason, after I received my parents' blessing, I started to feel much more anxious. And I couldn't put my finger on it, but Matt started to act a little differently too. Maybe it was just our nerves. Whatever the case, our last Friday evening was quickly winding down, and we were flying out on Sunday. Matt had to run last-minute errands Saturday morning. I stayed home to meet with my cousin's boyfriend, David. He was going to be subleasing my place, and we needed to go over some last-minute details. But I couldn't find the paperwork I was looking for, so I called Matt to see if he had moved it. He told me he had tossed a bunch of what he thought was junk in one of the extra moving boxes. David helped me dig through all the clutter. We found the paperwork, and something else too. David pulled out a folded up newspaper clipping. There was an article from months before about 3 escaped inmates, and under the headline there were 3 mugshots. One of the men resembled my fiance, but the man's name was different. But after David left, I just sat and stared at the clipping. I thought about how I wanted to bring the talk up to Matt, and it felt like all the anxiety I had been feeling was leading up to that point. Then my dad called. He asked if I was okay. I told him I was, but he wasn't buying it. Maybe he could tell by my voice. Or maybe David had told my cousin about the article and she had called my parents already. I found out later it was both. Dad drove over to my apartment. He wanted to see the article for himself. Then he decided to wait around for Matt to come back. I asked my father not to do anything crazy. I might as well have been talking to a wall. Dad confronted Matt in an aggressive way. Matt lost his cool too. I was trying to get both of them to calm down, but I also wanted answers. Matt denied everything, and he sounded believable. But the only thing not making sense was how the article ended up in the box in the first place. I had never seen it before. Matt said he hadn't either, and he stuck to his story. Dad said he wasn't allowing me on that plane the next day, and he demanded that Matt show his ID or Dad was calling the police. That's when Matt said he was leaving. I didn't know what to do. I tried to follow him, but my father grabbed me. But after walking out, Matt didn't make it far. Neighbors had already called the cops due to the loud arguing. Officers stopped Matt by the elevator and questioned him. To this day, I've never had a more surreal experience. It turned out Matt was one of the three men in the photos, and just a month before we met, he had been sitting in a cell serving 16 years. But after his escape, the judge added another 4 years to his time, so it was like his sentence started all over again. I started going to a therapist, but it took me over 2 years before I went out on my next date, and I was proposed to again, but I told my boyfriend that I wasn't ready that time. He understood. I still can't believe I almost married, traveled halfway around the world, and started a family with a convicted murderer.